Welcome back. So we've seen that Excel is capable of some pretty amazing things, whether it's retrieving data from existing data sources, or in other instances, auto-expanding to encompass new data as it's added. Excel can do a lot of your job for you, if you know how to ask. Let's take a look at another real-world example here. We're trying to keep track of unit sales on a month-by-month basis, and of course we have a chart built to analyze the trending data throughout the calendar year. But as you can see here, despite the fact that October, November, and December aren't filled out, they still appear on the chart. This gives the chart an incomplete feel and can skew the data if we're trying to analyze just everything up until now. Now, of course, I can add a new value and see the new value added into the chart, but again, the issue still stands. I can see everything that's not complete. The reason being is this is a table. Charts built off of tables are very limited. They can only represent data as they're told. If I click on this chart, you'll see that these colored boxes indicate the values that encompass this chart's table. Now, of course, you could reselect the data in order to narrow the scope of this chart, but all of that lends itself to being a little bit more work than necessary. Let's take a look at another style of chart. Here in this example, you can see that I've got a chart that's built out based on everything up until a certain point, and just like last time, I've updated it to include October. But this time you'll notice that October didn't add itself to the chart. Let's try adding another one and see what happens. Nothing. Bizarre. So in this case here, the reason that it's not representing the data is because this is just a regular list. When the chart was built, this was the only data that was readily available. In order to get this chart to recognize that there are new values, we'd have to go and reselect the data all over again. So even that doesn't necessarily lend itself to being as efficient as we'd like it to be. Let's take a look at one more worksheet. Here in this worksheet, the exact same setup. In fact, if you look at between the two here, it's almost identical. So let's go ahead and add a new value down to the bottom here. And check it out. This chart just auto-updated to encompass this new value. Why did this one work and this one not? Clearly something is happening inside of this dataset that wasn't happening in this one. But what is it? Well, I'll give you a hint. You've already learned about it once. If you've gone through the lessons in the Power User session, you've already learned about dynamically updating named ranges. Those dynamic named ranges don't have to be exclusively for VLOOKUP and index and match. They can also be used to dynamically update other formulas, functions, and in this case, charts. Go ahead and pause the video and join me after the break. Try placing new values in this dynamic range chart and watch the values update here. Welcome back. So let's build this dynamic named range chart here. Let's make this list-based chart function the same way that the dynamic range chart did. So how do we do that? Well, first I'm going to go ahead and put in a value I'd like this chart to encompass. Once again, you'll notice that it doesn't auto-update the way we'd like it to. The next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create some named ranges. Now, before we create these named ranges, what we're going to go ahead and do is build out those offset functions that we talked about a little bit before. So let's start. The first thing we're going to do, of course, is insert our offset function using either the Insert Functions tool here in the Formulas tab or the Insert Functions tool to the left of the formula bar. Once inside, simply search for the offset function. And we'll find it here. Now that we've built our offset function argument box, we need to build things out a little bit more so. We'll start with the month dynamic named range. Our reference point is going to be here, cell A2. Now, of course, remember, just like last time, we're going to need to absolute reference this cell to ensure that no matter where we're triggering it, it always starts here. Now, of course, month isn't actually part of the named range, so we're going to need to offset this selection by just one row down. So let's go ahead and in the rows column, tap 1, indicating that starting from cell A2, it's going to offset down one row. Now at this stage, we're not going to need to offset by any number of columns, so the columns value can remain 0. So our starting point is going to be here, A3. Just like last time, we're going to need to accommodate the height, indicating how many cells should be selected. Of course, we're not going to know exactly how many cells are in there at any given moment, so we'll need to create a dynamic updating function that allows us to count how many cells are currently active. Do you remember which one we used? It's not count, because that's for numerical fields only. No, when you're talking about counting cells with numbers or words in them together, you'll need to use the count A function, indicating count all cells that have values. So inside height, we've got count A, open parentheses. We're counting everything inside column A. Of course, just like last time, don't forget to absolute reference that column. And let's close out the parentheses. Let's not forget, however, it's counting 11 cells here. However, between January and October, I only count 10. Remember that count A is including the header, so we need to offset that. To counteract it, type in a -1, indicating that we now have a height of 10. So starting from A2, we offset down one row. From here, we then have a height of however many active cells there are in the entire column, -1. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we've got 10 cells that would be selected in this offset function. And lastly, a width of 1, indicating that there is only one column of selection. Once you verify that your reference point and your count A column selection are both absolute referenced and everything is working the way you anticipate, we're going to click OK. And just like last time, our visual indication that this offset function is going to work is that it's going to represent the value of the row it shares. In this case, we were building an offset function for the month named range that we're about to create. Therefore, the offset function is representing the same value it shares on that row. Now, of course, that's not supposed to make any sense here, but it does give us some indication that the function is working. Now that we've built that offset function, we're going to go ahead and copy it here out of the formula bar. So by highlighting it, I'm going to use my keyboard shortcut of Control-C or from the Home tab, the Copy button. And from here, this time, I'm going to go ahead and create my named range starting from January down to, I'll say, September. Now, go ahead and get to this point here. So at this stage, we've built an offset function that represents the month column. Once you get to that point, go ahead and highlight everything between January and September, pause the video, and I'll be right with you after the break. Welcome back. So remember, at this stage, we've copied this offset function that we just created in order to paste it when we start creating our named range. So let's highlight from January to September. You'll notice I'm not highlighting October because I do want some visual indication that my auto-named range is going to expand to encompass October. Having highlighted this field right here, I'm going to jump into the Formulas tab. And this time, instead of using Create from Selection, I'm going to define a name. defining a name will allow me to not only name my named range, but in this case, it will also let me directly paste my offset function into the refers to field. So in this case, this name will be dynamic month. Ensure not to use any spaces here. From here, I'm simply going to change the refers to my pasted function of offset. Now it's important to note, make sure you copy and paste it into this field. Don't just reference this cell, because if you ever delete this cell, the whole thing will collapse. Once you've done that, go ahead and click OK. Now that we've created the month named range, let's go ahead and do the same thing for units sold. Now, in order to get the same thing for units sold, we don't have to make a lot of changes to the original function. In fact, all we really need to do is change the reference from column A to column B for both the reference cell and the count A cell. Notice that my formula is now updated here in the formula bar. You'll notice that the field now represents the same column that we've updated the offset function to reference. In this case, we're now building it for the units sold named range, and so this cell represents the same value on the row it shares. Once you've updated this offset function, once again, copy that same offset function. And let's go ahead and this time I'd like to show you that we don't have to highlight anything really in this column. In fact, you don't have to do much of anything at all, because this offset function is absolute referenced. I'm just going to place my cursor here in the units sold column without highlighting anything, and I'm going to select the Define Name tool once again. This time my defined name will be Dynamic Units. Just like last time, I'm going to paste in my offset function. Please do verify that it indicates column B now. Once I've done that, I'm going to click OK. And there you go. Despite the fact that there's no visual indication that we've created these named ranges, they should be updated. There's two ways we can see if it's working. The first way is by clicking and dragging to highlight everything that should be in the named range. In this case, it doesn't seem to be doing it. This is because function named ranges don't necessarily reveal themselves in the same way that standard named ranges do. In order to see if that function is actually working for us, we're going to need to go into the Name Manager. Here in the Name Manager, there are my two months, Dynamic Month and Dynamic Units. In order to see whether or not these are visual, in order to see whether or not they are referencing the appropriate fields, I'll need to place my cursor in the refers to, and I see that everything is selected. Likewise with Dynamic Month, select it, place your cursor inside the field here, and everything is selected. Go ahead and pause the video and take this opportunity to create your dynamic named ranges for month and units sold. Once again, the way we got there was by building our offset function here inside the worksheet. Once we built our function, we then created two defined named ranges, and in both instances copied the offset function into the refers to field, and then gave it a name that we would recognize. Once we did that, we verified that both named ranges were functional inside the Name Manager inside the Formulas tab. In both instances, by selecting the named range and placing our cursor in the refers to field, we got a visual indicating that all values are now highlighted. Pause the video and try this out for yourself. We'll see you after the break. Now that we've verified our named ranges are dynamically updating, we won't need this offset function anymore, so we can get rid of that. But now what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to get this chart, which as we can still see is still referencing the old setup, to reference these new dynamic named ranges. In order to change the data that this chart is referencing, we're going to need to click on it and select Design. Here inside Design, we're going to select the data, and we're going to remove everything. You'll notice that this chart is now completely blank. We're going to start this from scratch. For those of you who don't have a chart, if you'd like to build this chart from scratch, let me show you that way as well. We're simply going to insert a chart. Having not selected any data at all, I'm going to insert a simple 2D column chart. Notice that I have the same blank slate. Now that we've got our blank slate, let's get back into our Select Data field. Now, it will be tempting to use the chart data range, but the problem with this is it's not necessarily as dynamically updating as we'd like. So we're going to neglect this here. The next thing it's going to ask for is the legend entries. In this case, our legend entries are going to be units sold. We'd like to keep track of our units sold in order to indicate what the series values will be. So we're going to click Add. The first thing it's asking for is the series name. What are we calling all of our individual columns? Well, they're going to be units sold. You can click on units sold or type it into the box here. I prefer to click because if I ever change the name, I'd like to see it dynamically update inside the chart. The next thing we're going to need to update is the series values. Go ahead and clear out the series values until you've got just the equal sign. From here, we're going to need to do a combination of things. The first, you'll notice that when we clicked on cell B2, it automatically added our list-based charts sheet reference. We're going to want to add that as well. So take your cursor and find the name of the worksheet you're currently in that contains the named range you'd like to reference, and click. A single click will add the worksheet reference into the series values field. The next thing we're going to need to do is insert our named range, in this case for units sold. We can insert our named range using either the Use in Formula dropdown and selecting dynamic units, or by using the F3 key and selecting dynamic units. Using either option, ensure that you have a worksheet reference and your named range, and click OK. If you're curious to see if it worked, you'll get a visual indication in the chart. Our chart is now referencing each individual unit sold value. The problem is, at this stage, we have no idea what any of these columns actually mean. We'll fix that in just a moment, but for now, take this opportunity to catch up. Once again, the way we got here was by inserting a blank chart. From there, what we did was we selected the Edit field here in the Legend Entries. The series name is the name of our series, in this case, units sold, and our series values is going to be the worksheet reference followed by the name of our named range, dynamic units. Go ahead and try this out for yourself, and join me after the break for the second part. Welcome back. So now we've got our legend. What we need now is our horizontal axis, or in this case, as we like to call it, the column names. Now, our column names are here, the month values. So we've got a dynamic named range for that one as well. In the meantime, Excel has introduced just auto-numbered fields, but we're not going to need that. So we're going to click Edit. And in this field right here, just like last time, we're going to need to insert our worksheet reference. It's incredibly important to remember this worksheet reference. This won't work otherwise. Once you've inserted your worksheet reference, just like last time as well, using either the Use in Formula dropdown or the F3 key, insert your month named range. You'll notice that as I'm clicking on it here, dynamic month doesn't seem to be inserting itself. This is why it's always important to remember both sides. The F3 key is occasionally the only one that will actually work. So keep that in mind as we go throughout this. Now, if you have a keyboard that doesn't necessarily allow you to use the F3 key, in the Use in Formula dropdown, you can always select Paste Names, and that will give you the same pop-up that F3 would. So once again, verify that your worksheet has the list-based charts name followed by your dynamic named range, and click OK. You should see all the months listed. And in fact, if you move this Select Data Source box, you should see all the months at the bottom of your chart. Once that's been completed, click OK. It's time to put this chart to the test. We've seen that when we typed in this the last time, it didn't dynamically update. So let's add a new value and see what happens. In this case, in November, we sold 352. Moment of truth. And you can see here that the chart is now dynamically updating. Pretty cool. Go ahead and take this opportunity to complete the second half of this and join me after the break so we can talk about the final piece that is going to make your chart the most user-friendly chart in the business. Welcome back. So now, at this stage, we've built out this dynamic updating chart. And that's pretty cool. But now, let's take it the extra step and make this a fully automated chart that is so user-friendly, anybody, and I mean anybody, can take it and view exactly the data they need when they need it. Let's go ahead and first fill out the remaining values in this chart. In this case here, December was a blowout year. Not bad. So now that we've got this up and running, what I'd like to do is be able to view any combination of months in order to see what the trending data is in a particular period of time. So let's start here. Here in cell E1, I'm going to type start, and in F1, type end. This is going to be my starting point to indicate what series of months I'd like to view. To start, I'd like to see January through December. Pretty straightforward. And of course, if you'd like to clean this up a little bit using some of these cell styles, you're more than welcome to. In this case, I think I'll go ahead and give these a couple of headings. Maybe center it. And I'll do the same thing for these values as well. There you go. Nice to see these cell styles come in handy. So what I'd like to do is, depending on what these cells say, indicate that change in the chart. So I should just be able to type 2 and see February through December, or change 12 to 10 and see February through October. Now, of course, at this stage, I'm just changing cells in a spreadsheet. They don't mean anything yet, but they can. So how do we impact that? How do we get that function to work exactly the way we want it to? Well, we're actually going to need to rebuild our offset function in order to reference these particular cells. To do that, let's start once again by inserting an offset function. Now, of course, the offset function is the last one I used, so it's at the top of my list. But of course, if yours is not, you can always search offset here in the search box and click OK. Just like last time, our reference is going to be here in cell A2 to start. We're going to start with the month here. Just like last time, we're going to absolute reference. Our number of rows offset this time is going to be just not 1, but E2. You see, I'd like whatever this number says to be the starting month. So instead of it just being 1 offset by default, I'd like it to indicate that if that cell says 1, to offset down 1 cell, meaning it'll start in January, which is exactly what this number means to me. However, if that cell changed to, say, I don't know, 2, I'd like it to offset 2 rows. 1, 2, indicating that February should be the first month shown now. So we're going to tie our offset of the row to this cell right here. Now, of course, just like last time, we're going to absolute reference everything. We're not going to need a column offset, so we're going to type 0 here. Now, what about height? Because surely height just can't be the standard count of all the columns. Well, you're right, it can't. Because if I have 1 here and 4 here, a count all is still going to give me 12. So instead, what I'd like to do is come up with a clever way of calculating how many months we want visible at any given moment. If I see 1 and 12, I expect to see 12 months. Likewise, if I see 1 and 4, I expect to see January through April. So how do you calculate that? Well, using some clever deduction, we can actually take the end value, absolute referenced, and subtract it from the start value, absolute referenced. And we're almost there, but you'll see that the output is 11. If I see 1 and 12, I expect to see 12 values. So we're going to add a +1 to accommodate for that offset. So if this says 1 and end says 10, I expect to see January through October, 10 months. 10 minus 1 plus 1. It's a clever workaround, and it'll work just fine. The last thing we need to indicate is width. So width is going to be 1 column of selection. With that all having been said, let's click OK. And there we go. Just like every other time, it is going to represent the month value of the row it's sharing. In this case, we built it on the row that said April, and so our cell represents April. If you built yours on another row, like say, row 3, you'll see January, and so on. Now that we've built this function, let's copy it. Remember, copy it from the formula bar. Don't just copy the cell. Go ahead and take this opportunity to pause the video and catch up to where we are right here. At this stage, we've typed out a start and an end, and beyond that, we've built out an offset function that is going to specifically reference the end and start values, using the start value as our row's offset, and using a combination of end minus start plus 1 to indicate how many cells should be selected from that offset. Go ahead and try that for yourself, and we'll see you after the break. Welcome back. So once again, let's make sure to copy this function, and we're going to need to take it and put it inside our original named range to update it. So where do we get to that? Of course, we go to the name manager. Here inside the name manager, we're going to need to find our named range for our month. And in this case, I remember we named it dynamic month. Here inside this field, we're going to go down to the refers to portion, delete everything inside that field, and paste our new offset function. Once that's been done, remember, click the green checkbox. So we've updated our month. Let's go ahead and do units as well. We'll only need to make a small change in order to get that function to translate. So here inside dynamic units, delete the same value inside the refers to field and paste. We're only going to need to make one small change in order to get this to translate to exactly what we want. And in that case, this is the anchor point, our reference cell. We're going to need to change that A to a B, indicating that our units sold reference is going to start from units sold and then offset based on the values. Remember not to use the arrow keys inside this box. It doesn't play nicely. Once you've updated the value of A2 to B2, let's click that green checkbox. And there you go. We have now built a new offset function that should dynamically reference our start and end cells. Let's close it out. In order to see whether or not this is going to work, there's only one way to do it. Let's change our start value to 4 and hit enter. And check it out. We now see April in the beginning, and because our end says 12, we still see December. If I change that 12 to 10, I now see April through October, just like I expected. I no longer need this offset function, so I can delete that from the worksheet. Go ahead and take this opportunity to make sure that everything works the way you expect it to. If it doesn't, feel free to rewatch portions of the video. Once you feel comfortable, join me after the break to really make this as usable as possible for everybody. Welcome back. So at this stage, we've got everything right where we want it. The only thing that really needs to be adapted is this. I don't necessarily want my users to have to go in and type numbers themselves. In fact, the concern with that, of course, would be they might start typing in the names of months instead of the numbers. So in order to restrict that, I'm going to introduce a tool that's relatively intuitive. A spin button. A spin button is going to allow my users to click up and down arrows to increase or decrease the values in the start and end cells. But where do you get such a tool? Well, we're going to need to start by enabling a tab that's currently not visible for me, the Developer tab. In order to enable the Developer tab, I'm going to take my cursor up to the ribbon, and I'm going to right-click anywhere. I see this view here, and if you've taken previous Excel lessons before, this is not an unfamiliar process. We're going to customize the ribbon. Here inside the Excel Options Customize Ribbon tab, on the right-hand side you'll see a list of tabs, one of which is currently unchecked, indicating that it is not visible. So I'm going to select Developer and click OK. And just like that, the Developer tab is now enabled. Go ahead and pause the video and enable your Developer tab if it's not already visible. Now that we've got access to our Developer tab, we can insert the tool we need to make this as user-friendly as possible. Here inside the Developer tab, we have access to a Controls command group, which enables us to insert buttons into the worksheet. Find the Insert dropdown. From here, you'll gain access to a number of form controls. Notice that there is a distinction between form controls and ActiveX controls. For maximum usability, ensure that you use the form controls buttons. The fourth one from the left, you'll see is our spinner button with an up and down arrow. Find the spinner button and give it a click. Of course, I'd also like to point out while we have the opportunity that we have buttons, combo boxes, checkboxes, radio buttons, and so on. So any of these are useful tools for a number of different purposes. In this case, however, we only need the spin button. Now a single click doesn't necessarily just create it, but you'll notice that I now have a crosshairs cursor. And in the status bar in the bottom left corner, you'll see it says drag in document to create a spinner control. So beneath start, I'm simply going to click and drag to insert my spinner button. Now, I need two of these. Instead of going back and inserting another spin control, however, I can duplicate the one I've already created while it's still selected by pressing and holding the Control key and tapping the letter D. Control D will allow you to duplicate that cell, or in this case, a shape. Go ahead and create your two spinner buttons and join me after the break. Well, there you go. You've inserted spinner buttons, but at this moment, they don't seem to do anything. Well, it's because they haven't been tethered to a cell yet. in order to fix that, we're going to need to right-click on the button in order to select it. Now, once you right-click it, we're not actually going to need any of these buttons here. In fact, all we're really going to need is the Properties field, now that this button's been selected. So, right-click on your spinner button until you've got the selection points here, and then go up to Properties. Inside Properties, you'll be directed immediately to the Format Control tab. Now, where might you also find the Format Control button? Well, in that right-click menu. By right-clicking, you can also select Format Control and navigate to the Control tab. Now, it's going to ask you for current value, minimum value, and maximum value. Before you update any of those, you're going to want to impact the cell link. The cell link will directly tether this spinner to a cell. In this case, this spinner is going to be dedicated to the start cell. So I'm going to give that a click. Now that this cell has been updated, I'm going to impact the minimum value. What is the absolute minimum value possible? Well, I don't want them to go beyond number 1. Now, the maximum value is currently set at 30,000, but there's only 12 months, so I don't want this spinner to allow the cell to exceed 12. So I've got a minimum value of 1, a maximum value of 12, and each click increases the value by 1. And I'll click OK. You'll notice that the Start button now indicates 1. By clicking away from my spin control, I'll now use the buttons to increase my start. Let's do the same thing for End. Go ahead and right-click on End, and this time we'll use the Format Control button. I'd also like to point out that you can assign these buttons macros. We'll talk a little bit more so about that in later lessons. Select Format Control, and just like last time, it's going to take you into the Control tab. We're going to link this cell to the end value. Just like last time, our minimum value will be 1, our maximum will be 12, allowing that selection arrow to drop down to January or jump up to December. Once you've done that, click OK. We now have dynamically updating buttons that control our chart. We can now increase and decrease the selection points of our chart in order to view exactly what we need to see when we need to see it. So if we're trying to see quarter 2, for example, of our fiscal year, here we go. April, May, and June. We can see that May was our strongest month in quarter 2. Likewise, I can increase the value to, let's say, encompass the entire second half of the year. So I can see here that we're steadily increasing throughout the second half of the year. Whereas on the other side of things, that may not necessarily be the case. Our first half of the year was a little bit varied. Go ahead and take this opportunity to pause the video and engage your spin controls. Connect them to your start and end fields. And then try out the buttons. Make sure everything works. We'll see you after the break. Hello, and welcome back. We're going to shift gears and start talking about some of the more advanced techniques available to us to analyze pivot tables. Now, if you've gone through any of our pivot table lessons previously, you've seen that pivot tables are incredibly powerful at taking data and distilling it down into only the data that we need. However, there's even more that we can do with it that isn't necessarily discussed in the introductory lessons. For example, here we are looking at pairwise distribution, and there's a lot of data. We've managed to crunch this data down into some simple pivot tables that are available here. Now, as I'm looking at this here, I see Bob Oatley through Roland Walquist all have some pretty decent sales, and we would be remiss not to reward them with a commission rate of some sort. In this case, we've established a commission rate of 8.75%. That's a pretty good commission rate. So of course, naturally, we're going to want to calculate that. Now, For those of you who are familiar with formulas, which is hopefully all of you here in the Power User course, it's pretty easy to build a formula off of an existing field. Of course, we start with our equal sign, right? And if we're trying to calculate the commission rate, it would simply be total sales multiplied by the commission rate. So let's start with total sales. And right out of the gate, we see that clicking on this cell inside of a pivot table gives us a different response than we're used to. And in fact, at first glance, it looks like gibberish. But if you look a little bit further, you can start to see where it's coming from. You see, pivot tables are designed to fluctuate. They expand and contract based on the needs and how we pivot the data. When you try to build a formula off of a pivot table, Excel understands that there's a chance that this data won't always be exactly here, in this case, cell B4. So instead of referencing cell B4, Excel uses a getPivotData function, which actually builds a virtual pivot table in which to retrieve this data. So let's go ahead and power forward and see what this does for us. So I've got B4, and I'm going to multiply it by the commission rate of C1. Now, of course, I know I'm going to autofill this down because I don't want to do this more than once. So naturally, I'm going to absolute reference that cell C1, using my F4 keyboard shortcut. So press and tap the F4 key to get that absolute referencing, and enter to lock it in. All right, so we've got our commission rate. In this case here, Bob Oatley's getting $109 in commission. Not bad. So let's go ahead and autofill down for the rest of these salespeople. Now, I'm no mathematician, but as I'm looking at this here, I'm fairly certain that 8.75% of all of these sales isn't 109. So what happened? Well, as I'm going down this list here of autofilled values, I'm seeing the exact same function in every single cell. You see, the getPivotData function doesn't autofill. It's an absolute reference. It's referencing the exact cell we clicked on. So if there were all of these individuals here and I wanted to calculate all of their commission, right now as it stands, I'd have to do them all individually. And that seems like a bit more work than I'm willing to invest. So let's try this again. I'm going to go ahead and clear out everything. And before I do anything this time, we're actually going to tell Excel that we don't really care about if the data changes here. We really just want to get that relative cell reference so that we can build formulas the way we're comfortable with. To turn off this getPivotData function, we're going to need to jump inside the Analyze tab, which can be found up here in the ribbon. Now, of course, if you don't see the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab, make sure that you're clicked inside the pivot table. Because this is a contextual tool tab, it only makes itself available when you're inside a pivot table. So inside the Analyze tab, I'm looking around and I don't really see anything about getPivotData, but I do see Options on the far left-hand side of the Analyze tab. Find that Options button and click the drop-down. Sure enough, there's a little checkbox saying Generate getPivotData. So let's uncheck that checkbox. With that having been done, let's try again. Once again, we're going to start with the equal sign, and I'm going to click on total sales for Bob Oatley. Much better. By turning off the Generate getPivotData function, we enable relative references that allow us to choose the cell specifically instead of the actual presence this cell contains inside the pivot table. So I'll do B4 multiplied by the absolute reference of C1. Alright, so I've got my 109, and just to make sure it works, I'll autofill down. And there you go. Building formulas and pivot tables doesn't have to be hard. You just gotta know where the settings are. Once again, the way we got there was by clicking inside the pivot table and navigating to the Analyze tab. Inside the Analyze tab, we used the Options menu dropdown and turned off the Generate getPivotData function tool. Go ahead and pause the video and try building out this formula for yourself. We'll see you after the break. So you're starting to see that it's pretty easy to work with data inside of pivot tables when you know that there are options available. Let's try another example. In the last instance, we saw that we were able to build formulas from the outside referencing inside a pivot table. However, that's not always going to be the way that we want to analyze data. Sometimes we want that data to live inside the pivot table itself. And there's a couple of different ways that we can do that, using calculated items or calculated fields. Now, with similar names, they do share some common traits, but they are different tools. Let's start with something very similar to what we just did, calculating a column field using data inside the pivot table. In this case, we'd like to find out the total sales per unit sold. Well, it's a relatively simple breakdown. You divide total sales by the total quantity counted. However, instead of building an outside formula here that would eventually get deleted if the pivot table changed, I'm going to build out a calculated field that simply addends itself to the existing pivot table, meaning that it would ebb and flow, expand and contract as the rest of the pivot table changes. To build out a calculated field, we're going to need to be inside the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab once again. Inside the Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab, we're going to need to find this, Fields, Items, and Sets. Underneath Fields, Items, and Sets, you'll see the option for Calculated Field. If you don't see Calculated Field highlighted or able to be clicked, make sure your cursor is somewhere inside one of these two columns, the total sales or total quantity. It's important that your cursor is in a place where Excel knows what you're trying to do with it. In this case, we're trying to create another calculated column. So let's select that calculated field, and we'll get this view right here. Now, a calculated field can be just some basic arithmetic between multiple field lists. In this case, because we want to calculate the total sales per unit, we're going to be dividing total sales. So I'm going to find sales here in the fields list. And by clicking on it, I'm going to select Insert Field. So now I've got sales up here in the formula field. So I've got sales divided by, inserting my division slash there, quantity. Once again, highlighting it and selecting the insert field. Now before I go any further, of course, I'll name this something a little bit more appropriate. Maybe something to the effect of SPU, sales per unit. Now before I click OK, of course, I'm going to want to ensure that I click Add. It's very, very important. Boom. And just like that, I've added SPU as a calculated field. To lock it in, I simply click OK. There it is. Now at this stage, it's called sum of SPU. Of course, I can change that. To update this calculated field, I'll update it the same way I do any other field. Right-clicking on it, selecting number format, and in this case, sum of SPU, we're calculating the currency value. And I'm not in love with the term sum of SPU, so I'm going to right-click and change the value field settings to be something a little bit more readable, like sales per unit. And I'll click OK. So there you go. We now have a sales per unit calculated field. Another really cool benefit of this is it's also available now as a pivot table field that can be added and removed from the pivot table for later use. So if I want to view a pivot table that's just sales per unit, I can actually pull out total sales and total quantity and have a pivot table that's exclusively based on this new calculated sales per unit field. Not bad. Go ahead and pause the video and try this out for yourself. Once again, the way we got here was by placing our cursor somewhere inside the pivot table and selecting the fields, items, and sets. We then selected calculated field and then divided sales by quantity. Go ahead and try that out for yourself and join us after the break. Were you able to calculate that field? I'm going to assume you said yes. Fantastic. So we were able to calculate a field here, but what about the other side of the coin? What if I'd like to add an additional value beneath here? In order to do that, once again, we're going to need to place our cursor in an environment where Excel is going to know what we're trying to do. In this case, we're trying to create a new field list. In this case, we're trying to create a new item in this list. So by placing my cursor inside the item field, I'm now going to jump back into my Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab. Inside the Analyze tab, once again, the Fields, Items, and Sets list. I'll click on the drop-down arrow, and this time I will select Calculated Item. Calculated Item shares some similarities with Calculated Field, but it's a little bit more user-friendly. In this case here, my formula is going to be for the North sales team. Now, I know the individuals in my North sales team. However, Excel does not, because it wasn't inside the original dataset. So my North sales team, I know, is a comprisal of Bob Oatley. I double-click on Bob Oatley to add him to the list. I'm going to put a plus. Dave Robertson, another plus, and Geg Clayfield. So I know that these three individuals together comprise of my North sales team. Now, I don't necessarily want to have to go into my original dataset to have to add North sales team to every single sales record that has Bob, Dave, or Geg in it. So instead, by using this calculated item field, I can add this to my dataset. Once you've got Bob, Dave, and Geg with a plus sign in between each, simply click Add. I'll do the same thing again for the South sales team. This time clicking on the drop-down, you'll notice that there's now a North sales team option. I'm going to go ahead and type in South sales team. And we're going to clear out this field here. Once again, my South sales team, I know the individuals inside of it, but Excel doesn't, so I'm going to need to help it out. This is inside the Rep field. Once I click on Rep, my items appear on the right. I know that my South sales team comprises of Juan, my plus sign once again, Ian, my plus sign, and John. Once again, remembering to click the Add button, I now see that I've got my North and South sales team. I could do that for each of my sales team units, but for the purposes of this class, we'll leave it at just North and South, and I'm going to click OK. And check it out. We now have a North and South sales team breakdown. In this case here, we can see the total sales for North is 10,069, and our sales team for the South region, 9,154. So it's kind of interesting to see how we can actually add this to the existing sales field. Not bad. Now, of course, one of the things that tends to bother people about this is that the grand total doesn't necessarily make sense anymore. So in order to resolve that, we're going to remove the grand total. To remove the grand total, simply right-click anywhere inside the pivot table and go to the Pivot Table Options. Inside the Pivot Table Options, find the Totals and Filters tab and deselect Show Grand Totals for Columns. Once you've done that, click OK, and voila! This pivot table now makes much more sense. Go ahead and take this opportunity to calculate your calculated items, and I'll see you after the break. Welcome back. So we've now created calculated fields and calculated items. Now, of course, as you giveth, you must also know how to taketh away. In order to remove calculated fields and items, you'll need to follow the following steps. First things first, we're going to need to click on the drop-down for Fields, Items, and Sets. In this case, we're going to remove the Sales Per Unit calculated field. Go ahead and find Calculated Field and give it a click. And find the drop-down. Inside the drop-down, you'll see our calculated field of SPU. Of course, you can make any changes to the formula if you'd like, but in this case, we're going to delete it. And click OK. Likewise, to remove calculated items, ensure to place your cursor inside the items list, and click on the drop-down for fields, items, and sets, and select calculated item. Inside calculated items, the drop-down once again, and selecting each of these sales teams and clicking delete. Once you've deleted all the items you'd like to remove, click OK, and the dataset will resolve itself. Go ahead and take this opportunity to try this out for yourself. It's important that you know how to remove these fields, just as you know how to add them. We'll see you after the break. Alright. So pivot tables are an incredibly powerful tool for analyzing data, but every now and again it doesn't necessarily work the way we expect it to. In this example, we see that there are so many different sales records. We were simply trying to view how much we were selling in particular months in the year 2014. But because there were so many sales records in each month, it's gotten a little bit busy. We'd like to organize it, but how do you go about doing something like that? Fortunately, Excel's thought of this. Go ahead and place your cursor anywhere inside the Row Labels field. And because this is a common field of organization, dates, Excel actually has a tool available for us. Go ahead and find the Group Selection button inside the Analyze tab. Alternatively, you can right-click on these fields and select the Group button from the right-click menu as well. Using either one, let's open up that Group Selection, and you'll see that it automatically identifies these as dates. Now, by default, it's trying to categorize it into months. Let's go ahead and let it and see how it looks. And just like that, it takes all instances of January, February, and the remaining months of the year, and it consolidates them into one single easy-to-read list. Pretty cool. So if I'm trying to analyze a fiscal year for trending information, I can see here that we did great in January, and everything else was just kind of trying to keep up with that top sales. Now, many businesses don't just organize into fiscal years, they also break down into quarters. Fortunately, Excel is just as good at breaking down into quarters as well. By placing your cursor anywhere inside the dataset, once again click the Group Selection tool, and instead of organizing into months, I'm going to deselect months and select quarters, and click OK. And there you go. Excel has now analyzed these months and organized them into their respective quarters. Go ahead and pause the video and try this out for yourself. We'll see you after the break. While we're on the topic of changing the way we can view this data, it's great that we were able to consolidate those hundreds of records down into 4 simple line items, quarter by quarter by quarter by quarter. Let's say we'd like to take it one step further, and I love that I'm able to see the dollar amounts, but I want to see how much each individual quarter is contributing to my actual bottom line. First, let's go ahead and add sales to the values field again. On the right-hand side here, you'll see that I do already have sales in the values quadrant, but I'm going to add it one more time by clicking and dragging into the values quadrant. You'll see that it's been removed of all the formatting that we had in place, but that's okay because we're going to be making some adjustments to that. To change the way we view this, simply right-click and select Value Field Settings. Here inside Value Field Settings, we can change the name of our value field. But before we change the name, let's figure out how we'd like to view this data. It's being summarized using the sum function. Of course, you can change it to view the average, total number of transactions, max or minimum values. But in this case, I'd like to go to the Show Values As tab. It's here that I'll actually be able to change how I'm actually showing these values. Right now it's saying no calculation, but under the drop-down, you'll see that we actually have access to some really cool options. In particular, however, I'd like to see the percent of grand total each line item contributes to my bottom line. Having chosen an option, this enables me to give an appropriate name to this custom field here. I'll call it percent to total. And I'll click OK. Just like that, I can now see which of these contributed the most to my bottom line. And in this case, quarter 1 and quarter 4 were the closest. Now, we didn't have to go through that whole process. Well, we did if we wanted to rename percent to total. However, you can also get to this area by right-clicking, and in the right-click menu, find the Show Values As, and select percent of grand total. And to rename the sum of sales, in the Analyze tab, simply click on sum of sales and rename the active field to percent to total. So 2 ways, very easy to do the exact same thing. So now you have all the tools necessary to more easily analyze your pivot tables and present them to the people around you. Go ahead and pause the video and try this out for yourself. So we've seen that there are some pretty amazing ways that we can work with Excel to do more than we realized was possible. Let's talk about another really cool way that we can work with Excel in order to get it to do exactly what we want it to do, and to help alleviate some of the pain points that we run into when we're working with Excel. If you've ever tried to bring in data from an existing data source, particularly from the web, you might have noticed that it's kind of a pain. For example, I'll go ahead and insert a new sheet here. I'd like to bring in data from CNN Money. Being the money mogul that I am, I'd like to bring in some of the latest commodities sales in order to track them in my Excel formulas. He who has the latest data, after all, is the most ahead of the game. Now, I see here that I've got my commodities information, and I'd simply like to bring that into my Excel spreadsheet. But if you've ever tried to copy something from the web, you might be aware that it's kind of a pain point. So I'm going to click and drag to try and select everything in my commodities field here. And it looks about as good as it's going to get here, so I'm going to copy it using my Control-C keyboard shortcut, or of course I can use the File Copy button if you still have access to that in your web browser. And I'm going to, here in Excel, just paste it using my Control-V keyboard shortcut or the Paste button. And you can see here that it didn't exactly do what I hoped it would do. In fact, it's kind of a mess. I'm going to spend more time trying to format this to get it to the exact view that I want it to than I would have had if I had just taken that original web browser page and written everything down cell by cell. So there must be a better way. Well, I've got good news for you. There is. First, let me go ahead and clear this out. Now that we've gotten to this place, it's time to bring in the data from our external source. In order to get external data, we're going to need to be inside the Data tab. Inside the Data tab, we're going to need to find the Get External Data command group and tell it that we're wanting to pull data from the web. It's going to open up a little snapshot of Internet Explorer. This is where you can go to find your favorite website where you're going to pull in your data from. In this case, in the address, I'm going to use my personal favorite source for all finance information, finance.google.com. And just like that, I've got Google Finance up and running. Now as I'm looking at this here, I can scroll down, I can get the latest Dow Jones, S&P 500. In this case, however, I'd like to find, here we go, the latest market pricing for currencies around the world. Now, of course, this is all currencies compared to the US dollar. So I'm going to go ahead and find, how do I add this table to my spreadsheet? You'll notice that a lot of these sections have little arrows next to them, little yellow arrows. These arrows indicate there's an HTML table that can be copied. In this case here, currencies had one all to itself. So I'm going to take my cursor and find that arrow and give it a click. And just like that, the arrow becomes a check mark. Once you've found the table you'd like to import, simply click Import. It's going to ask you where you'd like to put it. And of course, you would be amiss to not check out the properties, where you can name it, enable background refresh, and even refresh the data every, let's say, 15 minutes. Or even better, refresh the data when opening the file so that you have the latest file every time you open up the page. Once you've made those changes, go ahead and click OK. Click OK again. And bada bing, bada boom, there it is. With none of the frilly formatting, nothing crazy, no hyperlinks, just the data. And because we set up background refresh, every 15 minutes we'll get the latest market pricing of each of these currencies versus the US dollar. Of course, if you'd like to make changes to the properties later, once again here inside the Data tab, find the Properties button. And you can make changes to the name or update, maybe you'd like it every 5 minutes. And if you need an update immediately, the Refresh All button. So there you go. Go ahead and pause the video and try that out for yourself. Being able to import data from external sources is invaluable, and for the people that love it, it makes the biggest difference in the world. Hello, and welcome to the final series of our Excel Power User course. We've talked about a lot, but the one thing we haven't talked about is how to automate everything we've talked about today. We can automate much of what we do inside of Excel with something called macros. Macros are essentially little programs that allow us to consolidate lots of little steps into one single step. Let's take a look at something here. We're looking at pair company sales, and we'd like to clean this up a little bit because we get this report every month, and every single time they ask us to clean it up. Now, we could go through this whole process every single time we get this report, but if we have a standardized approach for how we clean this up, maybe we can automate it. Now, in order to create a macro, we're going to need access to our Developer tab. Our Developer tab isn't currently visible. In order to gain access to it, we're going to need to turn it on. Take your cursor and place it up anywhere inside the ribbon, and right-click. Here, select Customize the ribbon. Inside the Excel Options Customize Ribbon tab, you'll notice that many of our tabs are currently checked and visible, with the exception of Developer. Now, some of you may have the Developer tab already engaged if you've taken any lessons previously in the Excel series. But if you haven't, simply turn the checkbox on and click OK. Now that we've got the Developer tab on, we have access to a series of code commands. Specifically, we have the ability to record macros. We can actually record our step-by-step process for how we clean things up. If we do the same thing over and over and over again, by recording all the steps, we can run that macro and, in a single click, have everything done. So let's take a look here. I'm going to click the Record Macro button, and it's asking me for a name. We'll call this the Polish macro, because we'd like to polish things up. We'll assign it a keyboard shortcut key, but it is important to be aware that assigning it a keyboard shortcut will override any existing keyboard shortcuts beneath it. In this case here, we'll go ahead and give it the, let's say, Control S. No, better yet, we'll do Control T. Control T will be our keyboard shortcut to polish off this worksheet. Our description cleans up the monthly report. Once we've got a name, a keyboard shortcut, I should point out that the keyboard shortcut isn't required, but it is nice. And a description, we're going to click OK. And just like that, we're now recording. You can tell we're recording because in the status bar, we now have a stop button. And the button that once said record macro now says stop recording. So I'm going to go ahead and take my cursor and click here in cell A1. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and highlight A through E, and I'm going to merge and center. And let's say I'd like to change the cell style to a title. I'll do the same thing for monthly phone sales. I'm going to take my cursor and click on A2, click and drag, my cell styles. I'll make that a heading 2, merge and center. Place my cursor in the run date, and I'll type today's date. So today is December 3rd, 2015, run by me. And of course, because this is an output report, it doesn't have any headers, so I'll need to fix that. Associate, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. And then I'll highlight all of that. Give it a heading 3. And what the heck, I'll bold this and right align. And left align. All right, there we go. So let's go ahead and stop recording this macro now and see what that did for us. To stop recording the macro, simply click the stop button at the bottom in the status bar or from the developer tab here where it says stop recording. Now that we've recorded that macro, I'd like to see if it actually worked. So I'm going to go over to this next output report and I'm going to run it. So, moment of truth here, I'm going to find the macros button here inside the developer tab, which will show me all the macros that I currently have available. Here I find the polish macro, and I can click run, or I could have used my keyboard shortcut of Control T. Either way, I'm going to run it. Boom, check it out. Everything is exactly the way I set it up. So this macro will now do exactly what I asked it to do. Not bad. Go ahead and take this opportunity to try this out for yourself, and join me after the break. Once again, remember, we recorded the macro from the developer tab by selecting record macro. Once we set up all the details for recording the macro, we simply proceeded through all of the steps that we usually do in order to create this report. Try it out for yourself and then run it on the second sheet to make sure that everything recorded just the way you expected. Welcome back. Well, congratulations, you've recorded your first macro. If things didn't work out the way you expected, you can always just re-record and try again. Let's try one more macro, this time a little bit more simple. I'm going to start by, of course, going to the Developer tab and selecting Record Macro. And my macro name will be Extra Polish. I won't give it a keyboard shortcut this time, but I'll say Edits the full field of data, and I'll click OK. Never forget, Excel hates spaces inside the name, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that space. Boop. All right, so I'm now recording. So I'm going to do this is very simple. I'm going to highlight the whole data set, and I'm going to give it the cell style of output. Voila, there you go. And I'm going to stop recording my macro. Pretty simple. So now I'm going to go ahead and run it here. So I'm going to go to my Developer tab, Macros, Polish, or Extra Polish rather, Run. There you go. So let's try all of this, both of our macros, in the More Data field here. I'm going to click on Macros. I'm going to select Polish and run it. Everything comes out exactly the way I expected to. And now I'm going to click on Macros again to run my next field, Extra Polish. Well, check this out. It seems it took me really literally. What makes macros so great can also be your downfall. It was very literal when I clicked and dragged to highlight just these 6 rows. So I should have been a little bit more specific with how I wanted Excel to run this macro. So how do we do that? How do we tell Excel to be a little bit more open to potential changes when we're running these macros? Well, I'll tell you. First, we're going to need somewhere to re-record part of this macro. So I'm going to go ahead and in the data for recording sheet, I'm going to select everything here, and I'm going to clear all the formatting. To clear all the formatting, simply go to the Home tab and find the Eraser button on the right-hand side. Clicking on the drop-down, I'm going to select Clear Formats. And I'm also going to delete the run date and the run by. So let's try running this macro again. This time to record in the Developer tab, same deal, I'm going to record macro. I'm going to combine everything that I've done so far into the same field, and then we'll tidy things up in the VBA editor. So the macro name will be Data Cleanup, all one word. I won't give it a keyboard shortcut. I'm just going to click OK. So I'm now recording. I'm going to, same deal, click and drag from A1 to E1, merge and center, give it a title cell style, click and drag from A2 to E2, merge and center, give it a new cell style, give the headers a new cell style, run date, I'm going to type in today's date, run by me. And when it comes down to this part right here, I don't know how much data there could possibly be, so I want to account for potentially more columns and more rows. To do that, instead of clicking and dragging to highlight everything, I'm going to place my cursor in A7, and then pressing and holding the keyboard keys of Shift and Control, I'm going to tap the right arrow key once, and while still holding the Shift and Control arrows, tap the down arrow key. This took my cursor to as far right as it could possibly go and as far down as it can possibly go. I'll then use cell styles and apply an output. And I'm going to place my cursor now here in week 1, here in B7, and again, pressing and holding the keyboard keys of Shift and Control, tap the right arrow key and down arrow key to give this currency formatting. And I'll reduce the decimals. And there you go. So now that I've done that, I'm going to stop recording this macro, using either the stop button here at the bottom, or from the Developer tab. There we go. So let's see what that did for us. I'm going to, here in the data for running, clear everything out again. Using the Home tab, clear formats. I'm going to delete the run date. And I'm going to run this macro. From the Developer tab, find the Macros button, find Data Cleanup, and run it. All right. So everything looks good. Now, the real test here. I'm going to clear all of my data here from the More Data worksheet. And this time, I've got many more rows. Hopefully, this will accommodate it now. Developer tab, Macros, Data Cleanup. And we see that it does in fact work. Because I used the Control Shift and right arrow key and down arrow key, it encompassed as many columns as there were and as many rows as there were. So there you go. Go ahead and take this opportunity to create a re-record of our original macro. This time, instead of clicking and dragging to select the new data, press your cursor in the starting place and then pressing and holding the Shift and Control buttons, go to the right and down. Join us after the break where we'll fix the remaining issues in this macro. Welcome back. So at this stage here, we should still be inside the Visual Basic backend, and I'm going to go ahead and expand this just to make it a little bit easier to see. So remember, this is our code that we created by just recording the macro. And let's keep our eye on the prize. We're here to make some very specific edits. Now I'd like to remind all of you that you don't have to memorize any Visual Basic code in order to use macros. However, it doesn't hurt to analyze it a little bit to see if you can't reverse engineer what it is that that code does. For example, if I were to scroll to this very first section here, with selection, I can see here that whatever it is that I'm doing, it's based on the cell that I had selected. And you can see here that in this case, it was actually selecting all the content first. If I go down just a little bit further, you can see that with that selection, I'm merging the cells and giving it the title style, which is how I created that title. So let's go ahead and find that code that isn't quite what we want it to be. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. Here we go. So remember, my macro is almost perfect. However, I'm not always going to be the one running it, and likewise, I'm not always going to be running it today, December 3rd, 2015. So I've got to have something that's a little bit more future-proof. Let's start with the date. Now, in the instance of 12/3/2015, that's great if that's today, but if I run it tomorrow or the day after, this isn't going to work. So instead of manually typing the date in here, I'm actually just going to clear this out. I'm going to select the entire date, quotes and all, and delete it. And instead, I'm going to put in the date function. Now, for those of you Excel wizards, you know that there's another function out there very similar in Excel called equals today. Equals today inserts whatever today's date is. Well, Visual Basic has its own equivalent of that. It's the date function. So by typing date in there, whatever today's date is according to the computer that you're running on, it's going to insert that date. So if I run it tomorrow, it'll be December 4th, 2015. Let's turn our attention now to the initials. Because again, I'm not always going to be the one running this code, which means that it would be really weird if I were signing off on every single person who ran this macro. My name could get put on stuff that I really don't want it on. So we need to take a deeper look at this. The problem is, I don't know who else might be running this code. It would be nice if I could inject something that would allow me to ask the user to put their initials in prior to running the code. This way, as soon as they run the macro, it says, hey, what are your initials? And it uses that input to put it inside the cell. If only there was a way to do that. Well, as it turns out, there is. But it is going to require just a little bit of Visual Basic. Now, the good news is you've got me, so you're not going to need to worry about memorizing all of this. And again, I'd like to remind you that for day-to-day usage, you don't need to know any Visual Basic code, but it doesn't hurt to know a couple lines here and there. To jumpstart this, I'm going to go ahead and scroll up to the top. So here I am, I'm still in my data cleanup macro according to my comment lines here. You can tell that it's a comment because it's green. And I'm just going to drop down a couple of extra lines here. Make sure you're not writing these lines of code on any line with these apostrophes. Any lines of code on those lines won't run because those apostrophes are actually blocking the code from executing. They're called comment lines. So I'm going to go down to a line that doesn't have an apostrophe, and I'm going to inject a little bit of Visual Basic magic. I'm going to start with a dim function. It stands for dimension. I'm setting aside a field of space to store data. That space, I'm going to name it EMP initials. So I've got a dimension function ready to go. I've named the space, that dimension I've set aside, EMP initials, and I'm going to define that field of space, that data, as string, meaning as a string of text. So the data that I'm storing, named EMP initials, is going to be stored as text. So first things first, I've set aside a place to store the data when the user runs the macro, but now I need to ask the user what their initials are. I've got the space to store it, but I don't have the space set aside for them to put it in just yet. So now that I've named EMP initials, I'm going to define it. By starting out with EMP initials equals, and I can put anything here. But again, the problem is I don't know who might run this later. So I'm going to put a function known as an input box, meaning that on execution of this macro, there's going to be a little pop-up box that asks the user whatever I want. So I'm going to type input box, open parentheses, and you'll notice that as soon as I put in that open parentheses, Just like in Excel, there's little prompts that help guide you through building the function. Now, it's important to note that we aren't going to use all of these. And in fact, the only ones you really need to use are the first 3. So let's go ahead and fill these out. The prompt is simply, what is it going to say? What is it going to prompt the user to do? Now, before you start typing, keep in mind that we're defining this content as text, not as a function, which means that just like in Excel, we have to specify it using quotations. So I'm going to do an open quotations and type something to the effect of, please input your initials here. And I'm going to close out those quotations. So there's my prompt. The user box is going to pop up. It's going to say, hey, please input your initials here. I'm going to put a comma to jump to the next section. You'll notice that it starts bolding each section that you're in. So I just left prompt. I'm now in title. And the title will be something simple. EMP initials required. And you can put whatever you want here. Feel free to have fun with this. And I'll close out the quotations. And lastly, by putting the comma, I move over into the default section, where I can put and define the default text that appears in the text field. In this case, I'll put type initials here. And just like that. Now remember, the quotations were one of the most important things we could have done in here, because we've defined that content as just text. And I'm going to put a close parentheses to lock it all in. You'll notice as soon as you close out the parentheses, your little helper line goes away. So we've got the dimensions, which is setting aside a dedicated data storage field for something called EMP initials. And we've defined that as a string of text. Next, we have to define what EMP initials actually is, which is where, down below, this input box came into play, asking the user to input their initials, etc. All that's left to do now that we've set aside the space and defined the variable is to go back to SPB, delete that, and put in that variable field, EMP initials. So upon execution of the code, assuming everything works the way we expect it to, the user is going to get a pop-up box asking them for their initials. Those initials will be stored in the dimension named EMP initials as a string of text. And then, once it gets to this portion of the line of code, it's going to see, it's asking for the variable EMP initials. The code will then go to that dimension, pull the text that the user put in, and fill it in here. Again, assuming it all works. All that's left to do now is test it out. Now, it's important to note that the knee-jerk reaction is often to save this. However, keep in mind that macros are actually stored in the actual file. So you don't have to save macros every time you make an edit, although it doesn't hurt, especially if the macros are complex. We'll hold off on that for now, and instead, what we're going to do is we're going to jump back into Excel. Remember, you can jump into Excel by either clicking the green icon in the top left corner or using the keyboard shortcut Alt F11. All right. So now that we're back in our Excel spreadsheet, it's time to run the code. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to my final run section. And one last time, it's time to run the code. So I'm going to go to Macros, select Data Cleanup, and click Run. Oh, and check it out. EMP initials required. Please input your initials here. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, after typing in my initials, of course. Maybe I'll, just for the sake of it, I won't put SPB. I'll put my alter ego, WJB. It's actually my grandfather, Walter John. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And there you go. Check it out. It injected everything exactly the way we wanted it to. It put in today's date. It put in the initials that I filled into the field. It was that easy. Not bad. So to recap, we edited the code by going into the Developer tab, selecting Macros, choosing the macro we wanted to edit, clicked Edit, and we injected code that met our needs more specifically. There's a lot of really powerful things that can be done in macros. The last thing I want to make mention of before we sign off here is saving. Because we have active macros inside this workbook now, it's really important to note that when you're saving, notice when I click save, it says, hey, the following features can't be saved in a macro-free workbook. That's because you have to save workbooks that have macros in them as a special type. This is really important as well, that bottom line. To continue saving as a macro-free workbook, click yes. If you want to save your macros, you have to click no. At this point, you can save it wherever you'd like. I'll go ahead and save it to the desktop. Make sure to choose Excel macro-enabled workbook. So not Excel workbook, but macro-enabled workbook from the Save As Type dropdown. And I'll click Save. And just like that, this workbook is preserved and all the macros are intact.